close with what happens in the world of listening. So I want to introduce you to Jon Gibs, who's Global Director of Advertising Research and Development for Spotify US. Go ahead, Jon.
Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, etc. My name is Jon Gibs. I am the Global Director of Audience Research and Measurement here at Spotify. When we began to go into the period of COVID, when we started going into the period of folks staying at home, folks not commuting into their jobs, one of the things that we really wanted to understand was how these changes in behavior were going to change media consumption. We knew they were going to change commercial consumption, as the previous speakers have talked about, but for us, in terms of the nature of our business, understanding how media was incredibly important. So to be able to do this, one of the first things that we wanted to be able to do was to understand what were some base behavioral trends that we were observing in the marketplace. And we really landed on sort of 5 key issues that we saw as being significant changes in the market. One, obviously, the reduced commute that folks have talked about. Children being at home was a significant change in media consumption. Increased usage of smart speakers. Smart speakers, while the total volume of smart speakers in the market have gone up somewhat over the past couple of years, the consumption levels have gone up quite significantly due to the time at home. An overall increase in consumption of podcasts. And then finally, screen fatigue. As we are all here at a live conference staring at screens, I'm sure we can all understand what screen fatigue actually means. So based on these trends, one of the things that we wanted to be able to do is figure out what are the specific ways that this impacts consumption on Spotify, really impacts the way that people listen to music and podcasts overall. So the first thing that we saw was that every day was Sunday. Typically, when you think about how people listen to Spotify, or frankly, most audio content, it kind of looks like a double-humped camel, right? That it's sort of in the morning commute and the afternoon commute, you tend to see much higher levels of consumption, with somewhat lower in the middle of the day and tapering off into the evening with a spike later in the evening for a younger audience. On a weekday. What we saw was a real confirmation of both the weekend and weekday consumption until they were almost exactly the same. The real differences that we honestly saw with weekday at this point was that it began to start a little bit earlier and kind of go a little bit later. And it looks like people had lunch later on the weekends. But other than that, really the way that people are consuming audio itself was pretty much the same. So this wasn't the only sort of key trend that we saw. One of the things that we wanted to understand is how, now that people were at home, how were they listening together? And so as part of qualitative research, we were asking our listeners, how has confinement changed the way that you're listening? And so we have quotes like this. My wife and I typically listened a few times a week. However, now we listen almost 5 times a day as a result of the COVID-19 stay-at-home requirements. So how has this actually translated into actual consumption? Well, this brings us to our second trend, which is listening together. What we've seen overall is about 41% of listeners on Spotify say that they are listening in groups more often than they were previously, prior to the time of confinement during COVID. And what we're seeing is on average about 4 people listen together about 5 hours a day in those joint listening scenarios. So what we're beginning to see is consumption that looks a lot closer to either group viewership of video or kind of a harken back to the family sitting around the radio, rather than what you would necessarily think is sort of audio content being in your ears and sort of through earbuds, the way that we've thought about it really up to this point. The other area that we wanted to be able to get a sense of is, how has folks staying at home, how has COVID overall changed the way that people are consuming audio content overall? Are they listening on their phone still? Are they switching to smart speakers? Well, one of the things that we've seen is that devices like televisions that had traditionally been video content platforms have increasingly become audio content platforms, at least in the context of Spotify. What that means is, going back to this trend of screen fatigue, the TV is on either through a game console or through a smart TV. But what that TV is doing is playing the Spotify app rather than playing video content or playing gaming content in this case. And so the TV is on, the TV is still a media application or a media device, but that screen is really being used for audio content rather than visual content. In concert with this, when we were talking before about podcast consumption being up overall, and this is obviously an area that we care an awful lot about at Spotify. One of the things that we've really been trying to track against are what are the types of podcast content that folks are listening to across multiple different demographics. And both due to COVID as well as the US elections, we saw really significant increases across the board in both news and government content consumption on Spotify. Really, really, really significant increases in terms of the volume of podcasts being listened to specifically in these areas. Where we saw some difference from a demographic standpoint or in a group by group standpoint is we tended to see older demographics being a little bit more skewed to society and culture. And what we saw in a lot of cases here is the society and culture content that was being consumed tended to be a little bit more sort of throwback content, if you will. So shows that were recapping old movies, shows that were talking about older albums. There was a lot of nostalgia in the society and culture content that folks were listening to, really kind of getting us not just being up to date, but sort of making us feel comfortable in the content that we listen to. And the sort of trend of nostalgia overall was not just pervasive in podcasts, which it was, but we also saw a significant increase in the rest of our more nostalgic content overall. The last sort of key trend that we saw is one of the things we like to be able to do is to classify listening into multiple different types of attitudinal groups. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but one of the things that is not super surprising is that things like driving and commuting were way down. Things like kids and moody content were way up. But what was amazing to us when we looked at this is how clear it was across the world that it was all the same. It's very rare that you see any type of listening that doesn't differ all that much on a market by market basis. And this is one case where we saw it really significantly. So with that, thank you all very much.